then the general looked at me and said, well, I know you're a Christian, but please join us. We're happy to have you here. And right in that moment where 9/11 had just happened, we didn't know if planes were going to hit every big building in the world. And we were surrounded in a Muslim area, and being a religious minority, but being cared for.
On In Good Faith, we believe that all faith traditions have something to teach us about how God is working in the world and in our lives. So join us as we listen and learn. I'm sure you won't be surprised that as the host of In Good Faith, I go to a lot of different religious services besides my own. And while it can satisfy curiosity and be educational, the more I've gone, the more I've seen how being with people of faith strengthens my own faith and even my own practice. For instance, the first time I went to a Christian denomination with open communion, meaning any believer in Christ was welcome to take communion, I had a very moving experience when I went up and one-on-one, the priest offered me the bread and said, quite personally, the body of Christ given for you. Somehow, hearing that from one person to another was so much more meaningful to me than the way it's done in my own tradition, where a prayer is said, but then the communion is passed up and down the pews. So I haven't changed faiths, but when the bread and water, which is what we use in my tradition, come down the row, I hear those words in my head from that other denomination's service, and I have a more meaningful experience right there in my own chapel. But interacting and respecting other people's faiths can have benefits far beyond church and worship. Would you believe it's even good for business? Brian Grimm, with a PhD from Penn State, is the founding president of the Religious Freedom and Business Foundation, and he works with Fortune 500 companies, including religion and belief as part of their diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. Previously, Brian was a chair of the World Economic Forum's Council on the Role of Faith, a Davos speaker, a TEDx speaker at the Vatican, and director of Global Religion Data Research at the Pew Research Center in Washington, D.C.
My earliest really calling and encounter with God was when I was 4 years old, looking out the window of my bedroom, and I saw the face of Jesus come and say, Brian, be a missionary. And then his face went away, and that wasn't very specific, and yet it's guided my life from that moment on. And I was Evangelical United Brethren, became Methodist, became Baptist, now I'm Catholic. You know, missionary has a different connotation in all of those different denominations, different backgrounds. So it's really been a process of trying to understand what that calling is all along life's journey. So that's really seeking God at different moments, you know, listening for his voice and doing my best to follow it. I feel like I've done that successfully sometimes, and other times I've not been as successful, but it's that calling that keeps me going.
I feel like we could almost have a whole podcast just with me asking follow-up questions to what you've just told me about. 4 is really early, but you knew who you'd been spoken to by.
I did. And I remember soon afterwards, we had a Sunday school lesson, and the teacher was saying something like, you need to commit your lives to Jesus to make sure you have eternal salvation, because you don't know if you're going to be alive tomorrow. But you need to take action today. And I remember telling her, well, no, I know I'm going to be alive tomorrow because I've been called to be a missionary. I knew it was Jesus. I knew it was the calling. But again, it wasn't very specific. And so what I'm doing now, working on the economic benefits of religious freedom for everyone, including people that don't have a religious faith, that journey came about as I worked in different kinds of mission callings through the years and seeing just how important it is, because I've changed my own faith and I've had the opportunity to meet many of the senior brethren in your church, and there's a great respect there. But, you know, that's a journey, because it's not a given that we appreciate each other's backgrounds from different faiths and beliefs that don't share our own. So I think that calling keeps calling me into new encounters and new ways and a new importance that each of us has that freedom to find and follow God.
Yeah, which freedom you have been able to exercise when you felt a change or a call to a new place, a different denomination.
Yeah, and different decisions along the way. My wife and I became Catholic at the same time in 1994. So that one has stuck. But we were Baptists for a while, Baptist missionaries, and then before that, Methodists. And at each stage, it was just trying to discern God's calling and then where was the best home for us. And even though people from the outside look at the Catholic Church and see it as very monolithic, but within the Catholic Church, there's so much diversity. There's Jesuits and Dominicans and all kinds of orders and different expressions. There's the Catholic charismatic movement that is very evangelical, you could say, in its spirit. And then you have contemplative and conservative,
Yes.
quiet Catholicism. So I think that's part of what I've found is just having that diversity within a faith allows so much more expression, and you can find a niche where you feel at home. And then just the social life and the fellowship that you feel can be very different from congregation to congregation, but then that sense of being one in faith is shared by all.
You tell me if I'm right or wrong on this. I'm imagining if I had an experience like you did, that I would think, oh, God really does talk to us, like people say, answers prayers. So I think I would just have this expectation that this will be an ongoing thing and that I'm going to be hearing from God at certain points in my life. And what has that been like for you?
Well, it isn't that way.
Mm-hmm.
That's an exceptional experience. It's been like probably the most people that, you're looking for God's leadership, speaking within your heart and in the circumstances and those around you and the abilities and gifts he gives you, opportunities. But I think when you have a very unique calling like that, then it sets up an expectation of, especially in the Protestant church, people look to success, so to speak, for religious leaders. And it's like Billy Graham or these people that become mega church pastors and famous. And so in my mind, I thought, well, that must be, that's the road I'm on. And that wasn't. And I think that in the Protestant background I came from, when things don't work out, that's often interpreted as a sign, well, you're not really discerning God's way. Whereas in the Catholic way, when you're encountering difficulties and suffering, that may be the very sign that you're on God's track. Because working in the Soviet Union, working in Muslim majority areas, working in very staunch communist areas in those days was many trials and tribulations and setbacks. And I saw that when there were failures, that was often God moving. And it may have been for my own development, or it may have been to move something in a different direction. And the Catholic understanding of suffering and failure and all of that is part of what we're to expect. If Jesus was crucified, he was beaten, he was put to death, he didn't have a success journey of becoming a Billy Graham, right? So I think that's where in the Catholic faith, it embraces that idea. And even in the symbolism, you'll see in the front of the church that there's a cross with Christ. And it's just a reminder that the true sign of a faithful Christian pilgrimage is going to be a cross, that you're going to have crosses to bear in suffering. And that's something different than the Protestants have an empty cross. There's the celebration, but the Catholics continue to see in the trials that everyone has is that that's part of that working of God in our lives.
I think it's interesting that as you consider, is this a sign things aren't going well, or is God turning me in a different direction? In a way, you are your own interfaith counsel.
Yeah.
You can draw on different sources to sort of seek for direction within the different Christian denominations. I wonder if you would talk to me about how you connect that with the work you do. You founded the Religious Freedom and Business Foundation, and what made you put those two things together?
In 1998 to 2002, or 1999 to 2002, I was eventually the academic coordinator at the UAE Military Academy. That's the United Arab Emirates, in the Gulf, right beside Saudi Arabia in the Middle East. And that was the year 9/11 happened. And, I was responsible for a lot of teachers' families, and, we had to deal with keeping them safe. We had 20,000 Afghans living in our town And so it was a, challenging year. And that year when Ramadan came, there was lots of emotion, but I was sitting on my balcony in the early morning when everybody could just wake up and eat. And nobody did. They were all migrating to this big field, an open field that is an open air mosque that mostly men and boys went to and prayed, and the women were back home cooking the break the fast Eid celebration. And I realized that religion and religious freedom is guided so much socially, because these were people, there was no announcement to go there to pray. Everybody knew it. They were from all kinds of different countries. Mm-hmm. And I thought, there's a whole social force that puts people on a track in religion or life that maybe makes them open or not open to considering other points of view, other religious points of view. And so when I came back to the US and did a PhD, I wanted to study restrictions on religion. And so when I developed measures measuring government restrictions on religion and social restrictions on religion, and the two of those then combined to really define what religious freedom is for someone. It's the social constraints and also the legal constraints or openness. Once you measure something, then you can see how it relates to other things like the economy. So I did that. Then I was hired at the Pew Research Center, Religious Freedom. And after about 8 years of doing that and seeing that the trends were not getting better, I just thought the current way of trying to advance religious freedom for everyone is not working. And even the latest data from Pew that just came out in December, religious groups experience harassment in 97% of countries. And that's up from the previous years. Mm-hmm. The laws, if they aren't enforced or they're not respected or they're just ignored, don't matter as much. So how can you get a society to change and not just change some laws? And so then I saw, well, there's the connection between where there's more religious freedom, there's more peace, better environment for business to grow and be sustainable. And then I thought, well, it's really in business's interest that we have religious freedom. So how come business isn't out there at the forefront? And why don't you see that? So that's really been my mission, is how can you make the case to business? What, in practical terms, can business do?
Well, have you been able to draw any conclusions about why that is? I think most people running a business, and if religion comes up, they're like, well, that's not what we're about. But this idea that they, in the society where they do their business, might want to encourage religious freedom because it's helpful to them, if not just to mankind in general. Have you been able to put your finger on what elements cause that? Why is that true?
Yeah, sort of on two levels. In a community, if you take Northern Ireland, where the Protestants and Catholics, were literally at war with each other for so many years, you can't do business. So if you don't have mutual understanding, mutual respect, you won't have a peaceful environment and you can't have development. Yeah. So that's sort of macro social level, and even at the international level. But at the business level, when you have to go to work, and if you're beside somebody who's a Muslim and your other coworker is a Sikh and somebody else is an atheist, if you go into that work environment and think, whoa, I'm not sure about these other people, they're against me and my religion, I'm pretty sure. So I'm just going to back off a little bit and be standoffish. That's not good teamwork. You're not going to be open, and you're probably thinking, I'm going to find some place where there's more people like whatever my identity is to work. And that's really what businesses have discovered, is that if their workplace is a place where someone's core identity, whether that's being male or female, or being black or white, or being young or old, or being of this religion, that religion, or no religion, if you don't feel like this is a place where you're valued and welcomed, and then you're going to be looking for another job or not working as hard as you could. So right there, when you feel like you belong, you're going to work harder. You're going to want to stay longer. So you've got retention, you've got more productivity, It's easier to recruit people into an environment like that because they think, oh, I can fit in there. And then that's all good for the bottom line of business.
Lots of us in the Western Christian world, we just expect that we'll get days off for Christmas, for instance. That's just built into our society. And so I recall how puzzled I was when I found out that members of my faith in some Muslim countries have actually moved their Sabbath observance to Fridays. And members observe the Sabbath on Saturday, for instance, in Israel. So they still have a holy day to honor their faith and can still show up to work. How hard do you have to work to persuade people? Or once you start talking about this in the business setting, does it just make sense?
It makes sense. Following the news, there's a real backlash against diversity, equity, and inclusion. There's a lot of politics and culture war stands around that. But at its basic, it's the idea that companies have that you want to make a workplace where people feel like they belong and want to work hard and do their best for the company and work well with their colleagues and feel like, this is a place they can thrive. Making the argument about religion in that environment where people recognize this is important. Everybody historically is afraid of religion, but really it's when you try to keep things out and don't talk about them and push them under the table, that's when they become more divisive. So that's the work that I do, working with companies as diverse as Google and Tyson Foods and American Airlines and Intel Corporation. So all of these companies have embraced these kind of policies and see business success in it. And for companies like there's a global consulting company, Accenture, with nearly 800,000 employees worldwide. That's how they define their workplace culture. What it means to work in this company is to work in an environment where your deeply held beliefs and identities are welcome, celebrated, and valued.
If you're like me, you want to stay informed, even about some of the tough topics that have to be discussed. But so much of the discussion just really doesn't move anything forward or generate light as much as heat. That's where Top of Mind comes in, a BYU original podcast. They understand how polarizing those kind of conversations can be, and they want to help us engage in that challenge while actually learning something. Their goal is developing empathy for others. Top of Mind can help you clarify your own views, become an effective advocate for the things you care about, and even challenge your way of thinking so you can become a better citizen, a kinder neighbor. Listen to Top of Mind now on the BYU Radio app or wherever you get your podcasts.
This is In Good Faith. I'm speaking with Brian Grimm, president of the Religious Freedom and Business Foundation. I want to jump to a concept you talk about, building religious freedom or advocating for it. And you say there's a difference. What is that?
Yeah, so religious freedom can be limited by things governments and laws do versus things that groups in society and culture does. Mm-hmm. So if you want to advocate for something, that's generally been taken in religious freedom circles to be something that lawyers do. They're going to fight for changing this law or that zoning standard or fight battles. And all that's important. But it doesn't necessarily build a culture, build a consensus that these are good things. So to build religious freedom means expanding the space where faith and people of faith and their viewpoints are welcome. If you think of the potential business, if you could get every workplace in the world to make their workplaces accommodating and welcoming to people of differing faiths and beliefs, that would build religious freedom for billions of workers worldwide. When you think of building something, and that's what businesses do, they build things and they're good at that. And so I think just that concept of building something that's positive, we're not fighting against the enemy, but we're building things that people can join and anybody can do it. You don't have to have a law degree to do it, so to speak.
It seems less adversarial. Like here is this positive, rather than I want to stop this or stop these people or get those people to change their minds. How could they think what they think? Instead to say, here's this positive good that I want to encourage.
Yeah. And I think one of the critical things, though, is you don't have to give up your beliefs.
Mm.
Whatever your deeply held beliefs are, I might not agree with them. And we don't have to agree that what you believe and what I believe are equally right. But we need to both agree that it's really important that you have the right to believe what you believe and vice versa. So I think that's the secret to this. It's not homogenizing everybody, but letting those differences flourish and knock up against each other. So I'll give one example from a Sikh friend I have. We had a lunch together and we were talking, about different beliefs. And she said, well, we Sikhs, we don't believe in miracles. I said, really? She said, no, we rely on them. And, and there's a lot of, like, Sikhs don't believe in fasting. They don't see that as something they're called to. Catholics fast, Latter-day Saints have fasts, there's built in. So we don't agree on that and we don't have to, but we can certainly be edified and encouraged by those truly, maybe it's fun or maybe it's deeply spiritual aspects that we find in others.
So that's a mental shift, and I think a sign of spiritual maturity to respect other people's beliefs as much as you respect your own. So if it's sacred to them, you treat it as sacred to you. There's the famous Brothers Grimm, in this case with two M's, maybe because there were two of them, but you have one M, but you and your wife have worked together, and she coordinates study abroad for the Navy. And together you have authored Grimm's New Fairy Tales of Love Overcoming Evil. Can you tell me about that? And is there a new fairy tale you can share with me?
Well, I wrote an article recently about how when I went on a music fast for 10 months, it changed my life. Another miraculous time when God called us back into China, we went back to China and we decided to leave our CD player behind. And this was in 1994, so there was no internet, there was no way to get music, no Spotify or anything like that. And so we decided to leave it behind and we went without all of that music for 10 months. And I became a poet. And I'd never really written any poetry. It was just alien to me. I hadn't read poetry. And then all of a sudden, all this beautiful poetry came out. And the fairy tales, half of them are story poems. It was the night before Christmas and all through the house, not a creature was stirring. So they have that kind of lyrical storytelling. And that all came out during this religious transformation that was also coinciding with this fasting from this other soundtrack of life. So a lot of the poems were even just processing what we had encountered in that the push, things that pushed us away from what we were and the pull we were going. And we had families, some family members that disowned us, people who, when we became Catholic, said, oh, you're no longer Christian, you're going to hell now, and your children are lost, and even worse things. So it was a very difficult thing. And the fairy tales came out of that. And so my wife, one of our first years being Catholic was in China, then Saudi Arabia. And so as I wrote these story poems, she had these stories she wanted to tell, and she wrote one and she didn't know where to go next. So I just wrote a bunch of titles and said, here's the title, The Architect and the Artist. And that whole fairy tale is really a recount of the journey that she had in sort of breaking away from some things that were really destructive. The fairy tales really came out of that religious conversion, though we're not trying to promote any kind of religious doctrine in them, other than they came from our deep religious experience.
We have asked certain guests if they experience their faith differently, especially, for instance, if you're a Muslim and you live in a majority Muslim country, it's built into the culture, as you said, the early morning call to prayer and throughout the day. And there are times when many people will just stop, or society builds their day off around the Friday prayers or whatever it might be. But then if you are a Muslim and you go to a place where you're the minority, society is not built to cater to you. And what experience did you have as a practicing Christian being in China or in Russia or in majority Muslim countries, various places where you truly were the minority. Did that affect your faith or your observance?
Yeah, I'll give two examples. One in Saudi Arabia, where being anything other than state-approved Muslim and being affiliated with that and practicing that was illegal at that time. It changed a little bit, but it's still very restrictive. In that country, I was working there for a year with the family. At Christmas time, the boss came around and said, if anybody even mentions the word Christmas, you'll be fired. You'll have to pay for your whole family's tickets out of the country. You'll lose 2 months' salary and good riddance. Wow. And whereas in the United Arab Emirates, I mentioned I was there during 9/11, and the general called us in to work on escape plans and keeping everybody safe because the Afghans had previously rioted in the city. The prayer call went off. And at that moment, the general looked over to the sergeant who had been serving us tea and said, "You're better at this. You come up and lead the prayer." And so the sergeant came up, and then the general looked at me and said, "Well, I know you're Christian, but please join us. We're happy to have you here." And right in that moment where 9/11 had just happened, we didn't know if planes were going to hit every big building in the world. And we were surrounded in a Muslim area, and being a religious minority, but being cared for by the majority is what really propelled me on this course of why religious freedom in the workplace is so important. Because right there, I was welcomed. I wasn't made to become a Muslim, but they respected and welcomed me as a religious minority. It's an example of how important it is as a religious minority to be given that space and recognition. And when you receive it, it makes a world of difference.
So has that influenced you, now that you're back in the States, to be more aware of the minority and making place and being welcoming to those who do believe differently than you?
Yeah. And I think that's really a calling that Christians have. It's the largest single block of faith in the United States, is to love our neighbor and to do unto others as we would have them do unto us. And if I go back to that UAE example, that's how they welcomed me. And I really wanted that. So the Muslim in our country would really want that in a similar way.
I wonder if I could ask what things, whether it's a practice, an attitude, a scripture, or anything, is like a touchstone, or what makes you feel connected in your daily walk with the divine?
One is sort of the universality of the Catholic faith, knowing that Mass is being said every hour of every day, all around the world, same scriptures. There's a certain connectedness among all that diversity. I would say the other thing is just some of the physical things that, there's many ways I could answer this, but, like for Catholics to cross themselves, which I just did, is something that's very meaningful. There's often, you just feel like you need to have some physical expression of what's so deep inside of you. But I think that some of those, the liturgy, the movements that we do, the certain practices are a benefit. Those two things I think about quite frequently.
Many thanks to Brian Grimm for speaking with me. Be sure you subscribe to the In Good Faith newsletter. Find us online at ingoodfaithpodcast.org and sign up for behind-the-scenes access. This episode was produced by James Sturdivant. Our production team also includes Aaliyah Alexander, Heidi Hansen, and Heather Bigley. Our post-production sound designers are Mark Hansen, Ashton Parkinson, and DJ Cromarty. In Good Faith is a production of BYU Radio. I'm Stephen Cap Perry. I hope you join me again soon, right here in Good Faith.